Ready? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Don Hyder. I'm the Executive Director of the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics here in Santa Clara. When I arrived here 8 years ago, we had a grant-funded project about journalism and trust. And the person that was running that program decided to leave the university and take the grant money with them. But she had hired two really smart people, one named Subbu Vincent and one named Anita Varma. And they both came to me and said, we don't want to leave Santa Clara. And so in a brilliant moment, I only have once every 10 or 20 years, I was able to hire them both. So Subbu is our Director of Journalism and Media Ethics. And at that point, Anita was our Assistant Director of Journalism and Media Ethics. And also she did nonprofit ethics for us. And as I got to know Anita and started seeing what she was writing about and learning about what she had done in her dissertation work at Stanford, she had come up with this really brilliant idea that you're going to hear about today called solidarity journalism. And I said to her, you know, Anita, that would make a really good book. And somehow she couldn't do it at the time. I also told her, you know, rather than being an assistant director of journalism ethics, you should go be an assistant professor someplace because you're such a good teacher and so smart, you need to find a job. So she did find a job at the University of Texas at Austin, where I used to be a journalism professor, strangely. So that's my bit to tell you a little bit about the background of Anita and Subbu and how we got there today. And Subbu, I'll leave it to you from there.
Thank you, Don. So quick overview, we'll have an introduction to Anita by Maitri. She's the chair of anthropology. And after that, Anita's talk. And then we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A, which Maitri will actually moderate, and then we'll have a wrap. Keep your questions handy anytime. Feel free to note them down as she speaks, and then we'll get going. So, yeah, and the books are already here. We have a whole bunch of books both here and in the box there. So the books are for free. Anita's giving it with her signature. Please feel free to take signed books today at the end, after the event. So we'll go to you, Maitri Jagdish.
Thank you so much all for coming today. My name is Maitri Jagdish, and I'm the chair of the Department of Anthropology. So I have a kind of interesting connection to Anita. She was a guest lecturer in one of my classes. It's a Culture and Ideas class, first-year sequence for our students and on human rights and humanitarianism. I stumbled upon her work really fortuitously by looking at the Markkula Center and seeing that she was, no longer here, kind of looked her up and said, can you join us for Zoom? And she graciously was in town and able to join us in person. So what a treat to have our students interact with a guest lecturer. And we read what became chapter 5 of the book, which is really exciting. One of the connections I had is, well, my book is called To You in Solidarity, so it's nice to think about solidarity from an intellectual standpoint with Anita, especially in the human rights context, and especially at this moment when truth-telling reporting is such a critical part of our work, I think, as a social scientist, but also for many of our students who are kind of navigating what to make of the news, how to understand different forms of storytelling. So for anthropology students, we think about this all the time from a kind of writing genre perspective. So I loved her work. I love the critical design of the research study, but everything. And so it's just an honor to be able to have our students here and also to be able to moderate this book talk and see the book in paper. So I'll just leave it to you.
Oh my goodness.
Anita, and thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here on what I feared would be a rainy day. I am so glad, I'm so glad to be back in Santa Clara, to be back at the Markkula Center, and to have a chance to talk about this book. And first and foremost, I just want to start with gratitude. This book truly would not exist if not for two people in this room, Professor Ted Glasser and Dr. Don Hyder, who encouraged me to write, encouraged me to develop this book, and most importantly, encouraged me not to give up. I know we have students in the room, and by April, if you're anything like my students, you might feel like giving up on any number of long-term endeavors, but I really want to encourage you to think long-term. So for the next few minutes, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the book, and then I'm going to talk about the sequel, which which I have just started developing, which will look at some of the dangers of ethical reporting and truth-telling in these times. And then we'll open it up for your questions, so please be thinking about those. So wanted to share, and as Subbu mentioned, these books and more in another box are here for you for free. I'm not selling solidarity, but the very first sentence of this book took me only 12 years to write, and that is truth matters. Truth absolutely matters. And one of the major accusations against this book, against my work, against people who do work like me, is that we somehow think that truth does not matter. And I think nothing could be further from the case. Yes, we can have our different viewpoints, we can have our different perspectives, but at the end of the day, do you have somewhere to sleep tonight? Do you have the ability to pay your rent? Can you pay for your groceries? These are truths that are not really up for interpretation. And I think that level of truth is where we get to this concern that journalism ethicists have had for a long time around people's basic dignity. So this book is all about how journalists already, often in the Bay Area and elsewhere, stand up for people's basic dignity, their basic needs to survive. So in my own classes, I always give my students a plan, because otherwise you might be wondering, what are we doing here? So here's our very short plan. First, I'll give you my book in a very brief nutshell. Regrettably, it fits in 2 slides, but I still encourage you to read all the pages. And then I'll talk about the rising stakes of ethical journalism since writing this book. So I completed the full manuscript in 2024, and of course we know that the country and the world have changed in many ways, and in other ways stayed very much the same since then. And then we'll have time for your questions. So, solidarity in journalism in a nutshell. So this is the table of contents, and just briefly, each of the chapters addresses a question. So the preface is something that my own PhD students recommended I add, which is to explain where I'm coming from. Most literally, I come from Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and I did my PhD at Stanford and then came to the Markkula Center, also was an adjunct at Berkeley School of Journalism, and then went to UT Austin. But before all that, my parents are from a place called Bihar, India, which is one of the most impoverished places in the world. And when they came to America, they could not afford childcare, so my grandparents came to America to take care of us and really shaped how I understood and continue to understand basic needs, and why what we may take for granted, if you're fortunate enough to have not experienced nationwide hunger, for my grandparents was never a luxury, that they would forget the struggles for food. Chapter 1 is the introduction, where I answer the question what solidarity means and what it has to do with ethical journalism. And then chapter 2 is the question that I get most often when talking about this work with students, with academics, with journalists, with editors, with members of the public. Is that really journalism? Or are you talking about advocacy? As soon as we say solidarity, some of us think of picket lines, we think of protests, we think of petitions. But if that's happening in journalism, then is that really journalism, or is it advocacy? And then the next 3 chapters look at how journalists already do this. So another reason I'm not selling this book is that solidarity needs not be sold, because journalists already do this. So this is not an idea for something that journalists could try to do. It's not a pitch for an innovation that journalists might consider. It's actually something that journalists, some of them do quite regularly, but across US journalism, it remains quite rare. So how does it happen when journalists practice solidarity? The first question is, how do they decide what's newsworthy? What are they going to pursue? Who are they going to look at? What kinds of issues are they going to care about? The next chapter looks at how journalists find sources in solidarity. This question came up again and again through virtual workshops that we did at the Markkula Center during the COVID-19 pandemic and after, where journalists would come and they'd say, we love this solidarity idea, but how do I find people? If solidarity reporting requires that I find people affected by issues and I don't know any, then how do I actually find them? What I did in this chapter is talk to journalists who already do this type of reporting to see what it is they do to actually get the story to have sources. And finally, as my 3 mentioned, chapter 5 is adapted from some previous work that I did looking at how journalists report in solidarity when they're writing the story. So what's the difference? If you're writing a story in solidarity versus other types of journalism, you might see what kinds of things are happening in a story that's structured in solidarity. And last but not least, I assume by the conclusion you're all convinced, and the question that the peer reviewers asked me is, okay, if this is all working so well and we are persuaded, why don't we see more of this type of reporting? Which is a great question to get if you consider the alternative might be we're not convinced this is a good idea. But instead, the peer reviewers were so convinced that they asked me to develop a much bigger picture, a blue sky kind of conclusion to consider what would it take for solidarity to become the dominant norm in journalism as opposed to something that we see less frequently. And then in the acknowledgements, you'll see many people from the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics named, many of whom are here, and others send their regrets that they couldn't be. And again, I really believe, and I'll keep coming back to this in our time together today, that this book would not exist if not for the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics and Professor Don Heider's decision to keep me on, so I am only grateful for that. The appendix gets into what I did and how I did it, really focused on 2011 when I started my PhD until 2024. That was the last time that I came to the Bay Area for research interviews, and then I'll talk in the second part about what came after. All right. So first and foremost, what is solidarity? It's a commitment to social justice that translates into action. And this definition gets me into lots of trouble. So let's start with the easy part. Action means doing something out in the world, in public. I know some of you are intro to journalism students. I'm sure you've gathered that journalists are really in the business of doing things in public. It's not likely that a journalist is just going to have a private, closed door kind of meeting. So this is not just a private belief, it's not just a personal feeling, it's not just a promise of future action. We see lots of those: solidarity pledges, solidarity promises, solidarity documents. But until there's action, I want to suggest that's not really solidarity. Here's the part that gets me in trouble, which is social justice. Social justice means dignity for everyone in a society based on their inherent worth. This is something that Immanuel Kant articulated a very long time ago, and since him, many other people in ethics and other fields have argued the same, that social justice means dignity for everyone, not because they've earned it, not because they've qualified for it, but because we are all human. And that word all is really important. We all, I argue in the intro to the book and throughout, we all have an inherent universal moral right to live in conditions that respect our basic dignity. Whether you're a great person, a terrible person, a mediocre person, does not change that inherent universal moral right to live in conditions that respect your basic dignity. But what's this about basic dignity? Maybe my basic dignity means I need to have a great many things that other people don't have. Maybe my basic dignity means that I should have a great access to elite college education. Well, where are we going to draw the lines about basic? Well, I draw the lines at basic very minimally, which is to locate dignity at the level of basic human needs to survive. So why do I place basic human needs as the standard here? Well, it's because journalists do this all the time, where journalists will very often have some trepidation or hesitation about what kinds of issues are really newsworthy until people's basic needs for survival are at stake. That's when, historically, going back to 1808 in the United States and even longer in other parts of the world, journalists will stand up and say, hey, something's not right if people's basic needs, their needs for housing, their needs for food, for water, for clean air, are not being met. And I also include people's basic needs for safety. If you are not safe to walk down the street, then your basic needs to survive are not being met. So social injustice is when a community, not just an individual, but a community of people's basic needs are going unmet because of conditions they did not create, they did not choose, and they do not have the power to change alone. So I have a friend who often wears shoes that pinch her feet. You probably all have that friend. She's got other shoes she could wear, and so she just needs to change her shoes, right? This is not a social injustice that those shoes don't fit her. Individual inconvenience. In Austin, Texas, we have terrible traffic. I know Bay Area traffic isn't great, but I think Austin has you beat. But traffic alone is not in itself a social injustice, right? So we're looking at conditions where we can't just choose to take a different route to work. We can't just choose another pair of shoes and resolve the problem. And it's where our basic needs are going unmet, which makes this really much more serious than minor inconveniences. So solidarity reporting is where things get really interesting. That's where it's a commitment to social justice that translates into the action of reporting. So remember, solidarity was translating into action. That could be lots of different kinds of actions. But solidarity reporting is when we see this come to bear on journalism. So what does this reporting do? It does a whole book worth of things, but primarily it will represent and prioritize the knowledge of people affected, the knowledge of people who are being affected by issues placing their basic dignity at stake. I often say this at UT, we see tremendous news coverage of the cost of living and how it must impact UT Austin students, but those stories disproportionately do not quote any UT Austin students who would know the truth of what they're living and why. So to be clear, solidarity reporting is not just people's emotional responses. One of the most common questions that people who are not officials or not credentialed experts get is, how do you feel about that? Journalists will ask, how do you feel about that? And feelings may matter, but it's not necessarily indicative of what they're going through. If what I feel is nervous, excited, concerned, then that still doesn't really tell us what my knowledge is of what's going on. In solidarity reporting, we actually see more sources, not fewer, than regular reporting that focuses on officials. So solidarity reporting will include officials, elites, and analysts, but they're not going to be the ones defining the issue. Instead, it'll be the people who are living it who will define what's going on. So really, straightforwardly, solidarity reporting means starting with the people living the issue and representing them as the experts on the issues affecting their own lives. So this type of reporting has been celebrated and censured in the United States since the 1800s, which I find fascinating. So this is a major focus of chapter 2, but throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, solidarity reporting gets lots of fancy awards. The Pulitzer Prizes, I went through all their archives, going back as far as I could digitally and looking at other awards as well. This is solidarity in action getting awarded. They don't necessarily call it that because they hadn't read my book back then, but that's what they're doing. They're standing up, they're saying this is great journalism because it not only reported that there is a problem affecting people's basic needs, but it also led to change, led to someone doing something about child laborers being endangered, led to people doing something about poor people living in conditions that were freezing cold in New York, led to people doing something about disproportionate deaths in medical systems in North Carolina affecting marginalized communities. But it's not just a happy story. So actually in my dissertation a million years ago, I often talked about how this type of journalism is celebrated, and that's true, but it's also censured. And it gets censured professionally. That's different than censored, which we'll talk about later. But it gets censured, it gets kind of punished or scolded by the profession of journalism. This is where editors and publishers will say, hey, stop that. And journalism schools that will question whether or not this type of journalism should really exist, as well as journalism scholarship. I've gotten many rejections before this book existed that asked if I'm really sure that I know what journalism is, if I'm saying this is journalism. Well, I think that question is quite revealing in itself, and that tension really signals the stakes and selectivity of truth and truth-seeking in journalism. So the Society of Professional Journalists, which almost every journalism student and journalism aficionado is familiar with, they say seek truth and report it as the very first step of their code of ethics. And that sounds great and all. The question is how? So some people argue quite vehemently that we should seek truth and report it based on what comes from the podium. You might notice that I tend not to stand at podiums for that reason, but there is this bias to say if you have a podium, then you know what you're talking about. If you don't have a podium, I'm sorry, we're not going to listen to you. Even if you might know actually quite a lot more than me about what it is to live in the Bay Area right now, for instance. A second version of this is to seek truth in the majority. Maybe egg prices are not a problem until it affects most Americans. Maybe gas prices are not really newsworthy until the majority of Americans are reporting that that's causing a strain. And finally, we get to seeking truth in solidarity, where journalists would represent people who are struggling to survive, who are often not a numerical majority. Homelessness and housing instability still affect less than 5% of the population, even in most metro areas, even those experiencing a surge of this problem. And yet, in solidarity reporting, we would say the truth that matters, the ethical reporting, needs to focus there, even if it's not numerically the majority. So solidarity reporting means that journalism will move from the podium to the people. But is that really journalism, or is it advocacy? This is a question I've gotten over and over and over again, so much so that I did another workshop on this with other journalists who get this question quite often. And the subtext of the question is really, isn't that biased? Isn't it biased to move away from the podium and to the people? And my question is always, isn't it biased to keep your focus as a journalist solely on the podium, or treating the people as an afterthought? But isn't journalism supposed to be unbiased? Isn't ethical journalism especially supposed to have a commitment to no commitments? So here's my answer. All journalism advocates. Is solidarity journalism really journalism, or is it advocacy? Well, I argue, also in chapter 2, that all journalism is advocating for something. So before we throw tomatoes, let's be clear. All journalism advocates through commitments. You cannot do journalism without a commitment that the story you're reporting is a story. That in itself signals a commitment. There is nothing inherent or naturally occurring about what becomes news. This is an argument that Stuart Hall made many years ago. But we can distinguish between personal commitments and particular commitments and procedural commitments. So personal commitment might be your individual preferences. I myself have a strong preference for Lady Gaga over Taylor Swift. Lady Gaga and I have the exact same birthday. Okay, but I can still write a story about Taylor Swift without you knowing that. And so this idea of bracketing my preference for Lady Gaga, there's lots of people that argue it's not really possible to bracket that. But I will say in the course of doing this research, talking to all these journalists, many times, if they would reveal to me their personal preferences, they were often very different than what the story they wrote suggested. There's some interesting work being done about how reporters are often very inclined to hide what their personal preferences are. So you may not be able to see those personal commitments. Maybe not all journalism displays personal commitments. Particular commitments are explicit support for specific causes, specific communities. Examples like the labor press stood up for labor justice. That wasn't a mistake, that was in the name. Housing justice, climate justice, democracy, right? These are particular commitments that are intentional and often explicitly stated. But the part that this book really focuses on are what's called procedural commitments. Procedural commitments. These are woven in to the journalistic process. What I said about newsworthiness, we're going to have some kind of commitment to pursue a story at all. And journalism students in the room know likely that oftentimes it's not just the journalist deciding. The editor will have to see that as a story worth committing to pursue. You'll have to have a commitment to decide what sources you're talking to and a commitment to how you tell the story. So here are some examples of procedural journalistic commitments. It's a commitment to truth, a commitment to balance, a commitment to audience satisfaction, and increasingly in the United States, journalists are very comfortable talking about their commitments to democracy, shaping what they do and how they do it. Less discussed are commitments to the status quo, where journalists may find it quite egregious to deviate from that. A commitment to regressive change. There's a large media ecosystem that is currently arguing that they want to take America back to a golden age. That's backwards. And a commitment to progressive change with its own ecosystem that argues we need to move society in a direction it's never been before. And then we have a separate commitment to social justice, as I've mentioned. This goes back to 1808, where journalists will commit to people's basic dignity and demonstrate that throughout the reporting process. So procedural commitments will shape what journalists do, how they're doing it, and why they're doing it. So how do journalists report in solidarity? Well, this is chapters 3, 4, and 5. First, they've got to decide what's newsworthy. It's not because Taylor Swift weighed in. It's also not because Lady Gaga weighed in. It's not because a celebrity has said that this issue matters. It's actually looking at the stakes of human dignity based on what people are actually going through, where people are hungry, where people are unhoused, where people lack clean air, clean water, basic safety. Seeking out sources boils down to 3 practices that I feel like anthropologists originated. I cite many of them in chapter 4, which is, chapter 4. Going there, being there, and going back. Journalists will physically go to a place to do these stories in solidarity. They're not relying on a DM. They're not relying on a Reddit post. They want to see for themselves. And they'll spend time in the place, and they'll also go back after the story runs, both to continue reporting and to hear from people what they thought of the story. And I argue in that chapter that it really puts a commitment to everyone's basic dignity into practice. We saw this happen after the Uvalde shooting, that many people in Uvalde were extremely frustrated that there were journalists parachuting in on the worst day of that community's life after the shooting and then disappeared. So that kind of vulture activity doesn't happen in solidarity reporting. These journalists, even without time, without resources, without institutional support, some of the TV journalists I interviewed, they went back on their day off. And I said, how did you get the idea to do that, to go back, to talk to homeless people and show them the story after it ran? And the journalist, who was one of several who told me they did this, she looked at me like I had 10 heads. She said it wasn't an idea, it was just humanity. I think that's so telling, and that's why I connect all of this to ethical journalism, which is that these journalists are not suggesting that they have some journalistic innovation. They are not sitting down to say, we did something special, look at us, let's get a prize for it. They believe that what they're doing is simply standing up for people's basic humanity. The interview questions that journalists will ask in solidarity are different. They're not asking, how do you feel about that? Some journalists told me they noticed that people would be offended by that question because how would you feel if the city took away all of your belongings? I mean, every single thing other than what you could hold in your hands is now gone. Someone asking, how do you feel about that might be a little bit off key. So instead, journalists would ask very simple questions. What's happening? What do you think? And what do you need? In terms of quote selection, they were not looking for the most controversial quote. They were actually looking to represent the perspectives of all the people they spoke to, and that's important, that they were talking to multiple people. This comes up in chapter 5, that these stories never rely on just one person. So there's a fascinating genre of reporting called profiling, where you have an individual profile. Full disclosure, journalists have written individual profiles of me. I love them, put them on my website. But that is not solidarity reporting. Solidarity reporting always involves people, plural, and that's so that one person's experience is not being used to stand in for everyone's. And finally, solidarity reporting impact is not going to be in the number of reshares you get. This type of reporting may get awards. It's very unlikely to go viral on social media, but instead, the reason that journalists keep doing this work is that they say we don't want to make it seem normal that people's basic needs are going unmet. So this is what I mentioned about my book actually fitting on one slide, but still, read it. It's great. So as key takeaways, chapter 1 that argues that solidarity is a commitment to social justice that translates into action, and so is ethical journalism. Ethical journalism, I argue, is a commitment to everyone's basic dignity that translates into action. This is a minimal standard. Chapter 2 is where I make this controversial argument that all journalism advocates, and I bring receipts all the way from 1808. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 look at how ethical journalism will integrate this commitment into what journalists are doing, what real journalists are already doing in the Bay Area, in Austin, and nationally. And the conclusion is where I argue that solidarity is not about what you say. Saying I'm in solidarity actually doesn't mean anything. It's about what you do. Solidarity and solidarity reporting remain stigmatized in the United States, which is really ironic because, again, I argue that this is the very best thing that journalism does to serve society. I think there's no fewer than 100+ books right now that will tell you all the ways that journalism has not sufficiently served society. What I really wanted out of this book was to offer some insight into what happens when journalism does serve society. And the very last line of the conclusion is that the right time for solidarity in journalism is always right now. So I was coming down here from San Francisco this morning. I flew in from Austin yesterday, and I always notice the sky in the Bay Area. I think it's the most beautiful part of the Bay Area. There's so many beautiful parts of the world, but I think the sky in the Bay Area is the best. And from August 2011 to August 2024, I always had this feeling of looking for the light, looking for the very best of journalism, trying to focus not on the harms, not just on the downsides, not on the distrust, but what happens when journalism is at its very best. And that's why I really loved my time at the Markkula Center, where that was our whole job, to look and envision and try to create a vision for how that could become the norm. But since then, August 2024, there's been a lot of darkness in the skies that I see in Texas and nationally and internationally. So in 2021, I left the Markkula Center, as Don mentioned, for an academic job in Austin, Texas. Since 2021, I have been doxxed, trolled, targeted, and threatened by groups of people that object obscenely to, frankly, nothing I've just said to you. It's not that I censored myself to speak to you, it's that their allegations against me are not things I have ever actually said. So what I just told you, you can fact check it in the book and all my publicly available publications. That is what my work is. And yet this national disinformation campaign has attempted to discredit my research, discredit my public impact, and discredit my integrity, to claim that I am a paid puppet. Okay, so I had to leave my home actually November 16th, 2024, because someone smashed my windows while I was asleep in the middle of the night. And university police both said this would happen and saw it happen and said this is not random. They also believe that this escalation will get worse because of the book that I wrote. Now, what's the line that makes them think that? Well, it's this pesky word, social justice, which is right on the cover. So why is this happening? Consider, my focus on solidarity in journalism has not changed. Since 2014, I have had that as my research focus. My definition of solidarity has not changed since my PhD defense, April 2018, great day. My emphasis on ethical journalism hasn't changed. So what did change? The setting where I do this work changed. So keeping in mind, previously, 2011 to 2024, well, 2021, I was in the Bay Area. 2021 to 2024, I was still focused a lot in the Bay Area. But the stakes of discussing ethical journalism have certainly changed in this country and worldwide, as well as a vested, coordinated, and aggressive campaign that seeks to suppress this phrase, social justice, that I had the audacity to put on the cover of my book. And this campaign is aiming that we no longer say social justice, we don't write it, we don't teach it, we don't publish it, and we certainly don't suggest that it could possibly be a good thing, an ethical action for journalists to do. But one reason I was so hopeful when I emailed Sue Vincent and Don Hyder that I could come back here is that I am well aware that Santa Clara University has a long tradition in the Jesuit tradition of this thing called justice, right? So social justice is not something that I invented. It's certainly not something that is unique to this book, but I think it's so important to recognize and frankly applaud the fact that institutions like Santa Clara University still exist and are willing to use this word just in ways that are not very common in other contexts. Even this idea of social justice in your curriculum means that the work itself that I just told you about is not particularly controversial, depending on the context that we're in. But there are rising stakes to ethical journalism, and I would argue these stakes have risen since I wrote this book. So I'm starting the sequel. It's called Dangerous Solidarity: How Truth-Telling Persists in Hostile Conditions. So there are lots of repercussions of doing and studying solidarity reporting. This can include state and government action. It can include legal intimidation and chilling effects, professional censure, and social stigma and psychological distress from doing this work and facing threats for doing it. So these are a few examples you may be familiar with. Georgia Fort in Minneapolis has done solidarity reporting for a very long time. She was arrested in January. Frenchie May Cumpio has been doing solidarity reporting for a short amount of time. She's just starting out in journalism and has been sentenced to 12 to 18 years in the Philippines. What is her crime? Well, there are allegations that she committed terrorism, but this was all in response, as many press freedom organizations have argued, in response to her work covering rural poverty in the Philippines. And Sneha Barve is an independent journalist. The community in an agricultural setting called her and said, hey, there's an illegal land grab happening here. Please come and cover it. So this is a marginalized community in India that asked a journalist to come cover an issue affecting them. She went, and as soon as she went live on YouTube, a group of men attacked her while she was on video streaming. And charges were not applied or were not pressed, even though there's video evidence of what was done to her. When she woke up from a very severe concussion, she said, I will not stop reporting this story. She's done exactly that, to continue to show up in solidarity with the people who are depending on her. So these are some dimensions of dangerous solidarity. There's this global scope that this book is very US focused, but this is absolutely happening worldwide, including in the US. And also looking at the kinds of violence and destruction that it can lead to, as well as the fact that this is a collective issue. It's not in one journalist's hands. It's not one journalist's fault or one journalism professor's fault that this is happening. But it's a much bigger and frankly insidious kind of issue that goes beyond arrest, assault, and assassination. So those are the three that we might be familiar with, where CPJ and other press freedom organizations will stand up. But what about everyday conditions where you are simply afraid to bring your book to your office because it says a phrase that can get you attacked? Many journalists who I've spoken to worldwide explain that they experience a very similar sense of fear, uncertainty, and an unspecified sense of danger. There's not a court case they can point to, but they are acutely aware that they are also not safe. So that has led to me and a team of 8 researchers with expertise around the world to start this working group called Dangerous Solidarity. We're doing interviews with journalists and media makers in 15 different countries around the world to understand not only how do they do solidarity reporting, that's pretty consistent with what I already wrote, but how do they navigate these dangers and why are they taking on the potential repercussions, right? They could lose not only their jobs and their mental safety, but they could lose their lives, and yet they continue. And the most consistent reason they give is exactly what that TV journalist in Austin told me, which is that this is not a decision, it's just humanity. That based on their sense of humanity and journalism's public purpose, they will not stop. So these are some of the questions that I'm very excited to get your thoughts on as well, but this will be the focus of the second book. What happens when journalists are the ones who become a targeted community, where their safety is at stake? Such that doing ethical journalism, what Subbu and I have spent years and years encouraging so many journalism practitioners to do, could actually place their own basic dignity at stake. How will journalists respond? How will journalism researchers respond? And how will the public be affected? And most importantly, who will stand up to resist this targeting, and what will resisting cost them? With that, I would love to take your questions. Thank you very much. Chairs. Oh.